January 26 is Australia Day. But for many Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, it's not a reason to celebrate. Instead, it's a reminder of colonisation, the day the British claimed Australia and the start of the fight for survival of Indigenous Australians. And that's why it's also been labelled Invasion Day. The event is meant to unite the multicultural nation. And it's been celebrated officially on the same date since 1994. For many people, it is worth marking, with a day off work and new citizenship ceremonies.
That's that land taking, flag waving attitude. Got this new cut and cook dance to show you how to move. How you wanna raise a flag with a rifle that make us wanna celebrate anything but survival.
But there's also a growing awareness about how divisive the date is. And the campaign for change has gone viral.
So let's celebrate on a different day, the most Australian day of all, the 8th of May. May 8. Mate. Sure, it might be a bit cold in May, but it's not as cold as ignoring genocide.
The government says it doesn't have any plans to change the date. Australia's road to reconciliation with its First People has been long and complicated. In 2008, the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, issued a national apology for a policy which saw Indigenous children removed from their families and placed into white foster care.
To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry.
But the scars of settlement and dispossession run deep. Indigenous Australians make up about 3% of the population, but they represent about 27% of the prison population. Last year, the nation was appalled when pictures emerged of a 14-year-old Aboriginal boy in youth detention, strapped to a chair and hooded. At the time, it was likened to the treatment of a Guantanamo Bay detainee. Changing the date of the National Day won't solve the underlying problems of racial inequality. But could it play a role in addressing the treatment and public attitudes towards the Indigenous community? Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Sydney is Alan Clark. He's a Marawara man and a journalist with BuzzFeed News. And in Melbourne, Dr. Kevin Donnelly. He's a senior research fellow at the Australian Catholic University and is regarded as one of the country's leading education experts. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Alan. Tell me about the protests. Were they peaceful? How'd they go?
Well, the protests were largely peaceful. Every year, Aboriginal Australians take to the streets in pretty much every major city and hold what they would call an Invasion Day protest or Survival Day protest. So largely peaceful. There was a bit of a fracas in Sydney, in what was predominantly a very peaceful protest. But at one point, a young musician decided to try and light the Australian flag on fire, and that drew about 6 police officers. It was a little bit excessive that came in and sort of wrestled him out of the crowd and took him to a nearby police station. But apart from that, the march continued on to a concert in a local park, and it was relatively peaceful, and the police have even acknowledged that as well.
Okay, Alan, tell me why you support changing the date. Why do you want to change the date?
Well, I want to change the date because, first of all, I'm Aboriginal. I grew up, in a very small outback community as part of a really amazing community. But on that day, my family and my people feel really excluded. We would like to celebrate Australia with the rest of the country. We just can't do it on a date that's so divisive. For my family, it marks the start of a lot of horrors and genocide and massacres and rapes and, really terrible stuff. And this is not ancient history. It's within the past 229 years. That's only a few generations back. And that and some of those horrific things from colonisation we're still seeing today. So we're still seeing higher rates of Indigenous people being incarcerated. We're still seeing sky-high rates of children, Aboriginal children, being removed from their families. We're still seeing poverty. We're still seeing Aboriginal children dying.
Point well made. Let's bring in Kevin Donnelly. Point well made. Kevin Donnelly, one man's independence is another man's invasion. Do you have any sympathy or empathy with that view?
Well, I do to a degree, but the reality is the reason why we were able to have demonstrations today where we live in a country, a Westminster liberal democracy, where people are allowed to disagree. We have freedom of expression, people can vote, people can live their lives without interference from government, unlike many countries to our north, like China or Vietnam or Myanmar. I mean, the reality is we are a Western liberal democratic country, and that's a great thing. And it all began with the First Fleet. The minute Governor Phillip proclaimed the colony part of the British Empire, we inherited English law, English common law, Magna Carta, and a Westminster parliamentary system that's evolved over many years. But I would argue the reason why we're able to have this debate in Australia is because of the First Fleet.
Dr. Donnelly, you say this is, a liberal Westminster parliamentary democracy, and those are all great things. I wonder what you think about the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, saying anyone who wanted to move the date, quote, he said, I'm just sick of these people who every time they want to make us feel guilty about it. They don't like Christmas, they don't like Australia Day, they're just miserable, gutted people. I wish they would crawl under a rock and hide for a little bit. Does that sound like the words of a representative of this inclusive, tolerant democracy?
One of the unique characteristics of Australia is we do like to have a go. We do like to often get straight to the point. And I imagine internationally, when you look at the Trump election in America, when you look at Brexit in England, there is a sense now that a lot of people feel that political correctness has gone too far, that the pendulum has moved too far towards identity politics, about victimhood. The reality is there is a substantial Indigenous industry in Australia. All Australians are able to vote. There's a lot of charitable, welfare, philanthropic. We have the Mabo decision in Australia, where Indigenous people now have greater control over their own land. So I would argue Barnaby Joyce, part of the National Party, I'll excuse him today. I wouldn't use that expression, though.
Okay. Alan, are you convinced by any of that?
In a word, no. Well, it's a really bizarre argument to say, well, we have all of these, incredible luxuries because of the British legal system, but they're the ones that ignored a system that was in place here for hundreds of thousands of years. There was a government, there was a community system, there was a rich and thriving community. When the British came, they chose to ignore all of that. And first of all, we talk about the Mabo decision where we get control over our own lands. Well, that's an incredibly hard thing to do. But the Mabo decision, at the heart of it, basically overturned the notion of terra nullius, which was the notion that nobody owned Australia. And the British people used that because it was the only way they could claim this land under European law, was to say that it was nobody's land. So it was founded on a lie. Colonisation, as we know, is a lie in itself. And it took an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person, Eddie Mabo, to go to the High Court and prove that there were traditional owners in this country before the British. So that's not really a victory, having to go through that system and prove a lie. So of course I can understand why a lot of younger people are coming up saying, we don't recognise the Constitution because the British never recognised our sovereign right to this country. And so, yeah, none of that sits well with me.
Kevin Donnelly, this hasn't been a thing since 1994. I mean, this is not a long-standing tradition, right? I mean, it's been officially annually celebrated since 1994. What's so wrong about making some sort of compromise, saying, okay, we're all proud to be Australians, but let's change the date so the date is not a divisive one, which many consider to be a date which symbolizes genocide, dispossession, and you said victimhood. I mean, this was real victimhood. This was not imagined victimhood. Why not a compromise to say we can build this country together looking forward, but also recognize that there were some terrible things that happened to allow that process to unfold?
Well, two things. In fact, New South Wales has always celebrated the arrival of the First Fleet, and I think Australia Day began a long time before you suggested 1994. I think it was the early 1940s. The second thing is, I don't believe that the Indigenous people ever had a government. I think that's a myth. In fact, all the research I've looked at in terms of anthropology, Australia, the colony, those early years, in fact, there were many Indigenous tribes. They were often at war with one another. When you look at their conditions, their life, often it wasn't very, well, frankly, it wasn't very much like we have now in terms of democratic rights, freedom of religion, respect for one another. It was a very harsh, difficult life. So I think we have to be careful about this myth that somehow it was an Eden, a utopia before European settlement. And the other point I'll finish with is that when Governor Phillip arrived, he was told strictly by the Admiralty in London to try and negotiate to not be offensive or to invade, as they say. It was a peaceful colony to begin with. That doesn't deny the fact that over years there was warfare across what is now Australia, but that occurred on both sides. And you have to understand that many Indigenous people have in fact become assimilated and are very happy to be Australian. I don't believe in this idea of everybody having their own identity, Chinese Australian, Italian Australian, Indigenous Australian. We should all be Australian and celebrate and recognise what we are as a nation.
Dr. Donnelly, do you consider Alan as assimilated?
Well, I've worked a lot with Koori in Victoria, and I've been to Central Australia, Docker River, Ernabella, remote communities of Indigenous people. And the people I speak to, like Noel Pearson in Cape York, they argue, in fact, that we are Australian. That doesn't deny that we have our own ancestry, our own culture, if you like. But as a federal politician said some years ago, all people who live in Australia should recognise Australian values, our heritage, and should abide by our Australian laws. And I think that's only a reasonable thing to expect.
Alan, final word from you, please. We're out of time. 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kevin's views are completely outdated and, you know, are really out of step with modern society, and, you know, glosses over the fact that that intergenerational trauma still exists today. And, you know, it's great hearing from privileged white men who have never experienced the aftermath of colonization. He doesn't, you know, live with the fear a lot of my family does, or I live with, in regards to just, you know, surviving every day. I mean, I grew up in a very small town in Burke, and I can tell you now that, you know, this harmonious Australia Kevin's talking about, it just doesn't exist, because first of all, we need to acknowledge our racism, and we need to be more inclusive of our First Nations people and face our ugly past. And so I won't be lectured to on about, you know, what the Aboriginal community should and shouldn't be doing from someone who has absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay, unfortunately, gentlemen, I've got to wrap. It's been a privilege giving both of you a platform to allow your ideas to crash into each other a little bit. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.